Welcome back, and like what Adi have said, we are coming down to Sabah again. Just focusing on Sabah again. And what do we have, Adi?
Okay, so just a bit of a shameless promotion. I just recently published an article at the Daily Express just this week, actually, as the time of this recording. So exactly on the 18th of March. And it was just talking about federalism. Like Malaysia is a federation. However, I made the argument that we don't act like a federation. We act like a very centralized state with a lot of power being held in the federal government of Malaysia. And I made the argument as well that maybe it's time that this arrangement gets renegotiated. You open it back up, you make amendments to the constitution and say, hey, maybe this is not working out. This arrangement between Sabah, Sarawak and the federal government isn't really to the benefit of Sabah and Sarawak. So let's try reevaluate and let's try look at a different approach going forward, because I believe this actually is to our benefit here. If we want to act as a federation, we have to actually believe in the principles of federation, which means that power is decentralized from the central authority down to the regional ones, which is in this case the Sabah state and the Sarawak state government. So that's just shameless promotion for me. Please go read it. Maybe we'll post it on the Kopitiam Council Instagram. If not, my personal Instagram also has it. Just ask for me there personally.
Yeah, so what are the main contention with the issue of versus federal government?
So in this case, when we formed the Federation of Malaysia, we did not join, okay? Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore, and the Malaya Federation all agreed to form this new state called the Federation of Malaysia. And when that was formed, the Sabahan leaders actually stipulated within a document such as the 20-point agreement that certain rights should be protected under this new constitution, that certain things such as native land rights, oil, stuff like that, like resources and land management and land usage such as forestry and agricultural uses should be maintained under the jurisdiction of the state, and that the federal should not interfere with those arrangements here. But then over time, certain rights has been eroded. Back in 76, the constitution was amended to say that Sabah and Sarawak put on the same category as the other states in Malaya. Of course, it was rectified back in 2010 under the second Mahathir government. But at the same time, we're still having people arguing, saying that, we need to keep on fighting for autonomy, decentralization, devolution to ensure that Sabah actually does have the rights that was stipulated back in those days when the federation was formed under the whole agreement, which we call the Malaysian Agreement 19. So main contention is that we feel that some of those rights have been eroded.
Do you think Sabah and Sarawak were strong arm into forming Malaysia? So even from the start, it was already skewed towards the peninsula, because even those who represented in the Cobalt Commission and whatnot, mostly handpicked on from the British, directly from the British or from Malaya?
Definitely, because when you look at the Cobalt Commission, the people who are in charge are colonial officers, and Tan Sri Ghazali Shafie, who was the Malaya representative. There was no single Sabahan or Sarawakian leader, or Sabahan leader that was actually involved in the top executive functions of the Cobalt Commission. So already we had it's kind of like sending like a foreign element coming to Sabah and saying that, okay, and making their own assessments rather than having the locals actually have some say in how these kinds of assessments are actually carried out. And when we say strong arm, I think it wasn't more so strong arm. It was more so forced out of necessity, because Malaya also needed Sabah and Sarawak out of necessity, because Tunku Abdul Rahman believed that if Singapore joined the federation, that the Chinese voters would tip the balance in favor of them and kind of take away the voter agency from the Malays. So that's why he looked to Sabah and Sarawak to actually bolster voting numbers. It was a very, Machiavellian move on his part. And I think when it comes to the negotiation side, a lot of the people that were involved, let's say at least from Sabah's side, were mostly people who are seen as tribal leaders, as village leaders, people who within their community are seen as strong people who actually should lead it, like Donald Stevens or Tun Fuad Stevens, who was seen as the Lord Paramount of the Kadazan people. So there wasn't really a huge movement from Sabah per se. It was just left to the leaders to actually decide what's going to happen. But I think the same case was also the same for Malaya. There wasn't a lot of civil movement to actually participate in this. It's more so a decision made by the top echelons of the government, people who are who are the elite, basically, decision makers.
After 60 over years, and we could not, even though it's the same agreement, 19-point and 20 points for respectively Sarawak and Sabah. But after 60 over years, we cannot say the same. The outcome for Sarawak and Sabah are the same, because as we can see, their federalism is much better than Sabah's. Their political, how we would say, political source of power also is different. For Sabah, since UMNO entered Sabah in it is early 90s, it's never the same again for Sabah. Everything that it comes from Putrajaya, even the, well, conveniently, it was UMNO and Barisan Nasional was in power. But even now, with new, even since during Muhyiddin and Ismail Sabri, now Manadi government, it's still some sort of like following the trend. Like there's not so much structural changes. What happening, Adi?
If you want to look at the disparity between Sabah and Sarawak, both experience very different things despite 60 years of Barisan National Government. Sarawak, I mean, when it comes to federalism, it means that there has to be a condition where a state actually does have a strong identity in itself. Now, Sarawak, I would say, had an identity years ago during the whole formation of the federation here. Now, I would say this because Sarawak was under the rule of the British Raj as one consolidated entity, as one state in itself. And so it kind of delineated saying that, okay, this is part of the Raj, this is under administration headed by white people, and that it set up a whole bureaucracy out of it. Because you're going to administer it as a state, you're going to have a strong bureaucracy to keep tabs and information in terms of administration. Sabah was headed by the North Borneo Training Company and then changed over to the Crown Colony, handed over to the British Crown as a Crown Colony. So it had underwent, how do you say, a transition straight to the modern forms of governments very quickly. While Sarawak, they built that capacity up for at least 100 years. That's why there's an argument to be made that a lot of Sarawakian civil servants are actually very competent, and a lot of civil servants in Putrajaya are actually very cautious and very careful with what they say to the Sarawakians. So that's already one prerequisite that Sarawak has fulfilled. Sarawak knows what it is, basically. It's very consolidated, it's very strong in its identity. Whereas Sabah, even though at one point it was mostly dominated by local indigenous parties, it was slowly broken down and chipped away bit by bit by UMNO interference, UMNO meddling, and they somehow got Tun Mustafa on board as well. And then we had a whole, almost a near decade, where the position of chief minister was rotated every 2 years. So Sabah was always very malleable in a sense. It was always being changed, it was always being shifted around here and there. And in a way, it did not have that room to grow organically on its own. So that is another situation, because Sabah was, in a way, you could say it's hampered. Its political consciousness was hampered, and it was pinned by UMNO. Sarawak was able to sort of maneuver out of it because they had that strong state identity. And for Sarawak, it coalesced magnificently under the late Adnan Satem, who was able to unite almost every Sarawakian under a single rallying call, a clarion call, which is that Sarawak wants to be able to do certain things on its own. And a lot of Sarawakians leaders got behind that. They were very united in that regard, and that is why GPS is such a very strong coalition right now. Sabah, we've only just started with GRS, but even then, the voter base in terms of unity is very split. You still have the GRS, and then you now have opposition, which is Warisan and parts of UMNO Sabah. So Sarawak was in a way always united, and because of that, it could stand on its own 2 feet. It knew what it needed to do. Sabah we're still meandering and figuring out what is it that we can do when it comes to negotiating with the federal government. And if you have a strong base of power, then you're able to ask for the concessions that you need, and Sarawak did do that. I think still hasn't reached that point, but that doesn't change the fact that if the federal government is really true to the idea of Madani and equality, then it should also take an active role in ensuring that equality and equity is being transferred over to Sabah. Don't just wait for the leaders from Sabah to come and ask. Take more initiatives and take more initiative in going down to Sabah and figuring out what is it that Sabahans actually want. Because back then, under the BN government, it was very centralized. If the Madani government is sincere, then it would look into either restoring what was promised in MA63, or we should look into a new arrangement, a new deal.
Yeah, talking about new deal, I mean, since the formation of Manadi government, I mean, Anwar Ibrahim channeled a lot of money as well to expedite certain mega projects, especially at Borneo Highway, which is in Sarawak, almost done, or I think by this Hari Raya, it's already completely done from Kuching to Lawas. But it's a different story in Sabah. It's about the same huge differences in terms of project completion. What do you think is the biggest hurdle for the federal government to reinstate or whatever that was demanded in the 20 point?
I think it's because they just don't have a clue really of what's going on in Sabah. Sarawak is very vocal when they go to see the officials over in Putrajaya. They are very concise and very coherent of what they want. Sabah, I don't know how those negotiations actually worked out. I think only recently when Dr. Haffisz and Adi was the Minister of Sabah and Sarawak Affairs did we see a lot of tangible things happen, such as now that Sri Anwar Ibrahim allow projects to be approved by the state if it's under 50 million and other kinds of concessions. But now that that ministry is gone, now that those affairs and functions have been put under Sarawakian Deputy Minister Fadila Yusuf, who is a Sarawakian, that is going to shift more agency over to Sarawak all over again. So in a way, we kind of lost out in terms of, leverage. But we do have a spot on the technical committee, but that comes up to how that committee negotiates what it wants with the federal government. So the Action Council is chaired by the Prime Minister, the Chief Minister of Sabah, and the Premier of Sarawak. So this comes down to diplomatic ability. And because, like I mentioned, Sarawak has that kind of awareness of what it is, I think there's no issue for Abang Joe to actually ask what Sarawak wants. But in terms of Sabah with Dr. Sri Hajiji, it remains to be seen how his performance is as a negotiator. I mean, Dr. Amizan did prove his stripes in doing so, but then now it's kind of left uncertain. So in a way, Sarawak gets what it wants because it knows how to ask for what it wants on an ad hoc basis. Sabah, we're quite rigid in a way in that we always go back to, let's we have to go back to MA63, we have to go back to the 20 points. But what about things that were not in the 20 points or not even in the MA63 agreement? Sarawak looks beyond that.
There's huge rumor saying that the state election of Sabah will be held this year, maybe towards the end. Do you think any different by Hajiji administration approaching this election, especially zooming in from if you see from the lens of Malaysia Agreement?
I think it could leverage a lot on the Malaysia because we did succeed a few things under GRS, which Warisan has allegedly claimed to have started. But you could easily say that, back then when UMNO was also in charge, when BN was in charge, they did also get the ball rolling. So how far do you want to go back to claim, right? But it doesn't change the fact that a few things have been achieved under GRS government. The GRS government was able to get issue license rights for gas suppliers. I mentioned the 50 million projects. And also we were able to secure one seat on the board for LHDN. So there are things that are happening. And I think that would be leverage coming into the Sabah state election, either this year or next year. We have until next September, I believe, for the state government to actually hold the election, for Sabah to actually hold its state elections. So it could leverage on that. But I think in terms of moving forward or innovating the idea of MA63 or decentralization, I don't think that's going to be changed much. I think we're going to stick to the same script that has been used for the past at least 10 years, which is we're just going to ask for the oil royalties, which have been, I guess, debunked because that was under the Petroleum Development Act and not really MA63. But I think they're going to ask for, the 40% tax revenue that was promised to Sabah under Article 1 of the Federal Constitution. So I think that's how that's going to rally voters, saying that, if you vote for us, then we're going to fight for the 40% revenue.
Do you think because since Madani government formed also, there was a rumors that saying that representative from MPs from Sabah and Sarawak should be 1/3 of the parliament seats. Do you think this will bring any good to Sabah and Sarawak?
I think yes, because when Singapore left, a lot of those parliamentary seats were given to the federal government. Now Sarawak is asking for increase in parliamentary seats because they would like to see Sabah and Sarawak holding a 1/3 share in the parliament. But for Sabah, we never really started asking for it. It's definitely a huge benefit to us because it gives us more voting power, and we could move and have more agency into how parliamentary discourse is navigated, instead of it always just being dominated by mostly the Malayan states and their MPs. There's this whole perception that for here, there's no use to become an MP because you have to go to the federal. You're better off being an adun because that is how you can affect most change on the ground. But when in fact, when you go to the federal government, that is where the laws are made, that is where amendments to the constitution are made. So there's great power, and I don't think it can't be underestimated by a lot of Saban leaders. And Sarawak acknowledges that. That's why it is asking for more. And it says enough really that in a representative democracy that everyone should be represented equally. And I've seen a lot of arguments saying that Sabah and Sarawak shouldn't get 1/3 because it does not have 1/3 of the population. But when it comes to population density, a lot of people in Sabah and Sarawak are vastly dispersed within an area that's bigger than Peninsular Malaysia, and it's hard to get to. So you're going to need more, let's say, how do you say, districts such as Pensiangan or Kalabakan. It's a massive, how do you say, district, bigger, almost as big, I think, bigger than the state of Malacca, but it's only one parliamentary seat. While Malacca has, several, more than 10 seats. So in terms of administration, it makes more sense to break it up even more so that it is easier to administer. So not just the point of representative power, but also for ease of administration.
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg questions, because if there's no money or wealth in that certain particular area, economy won't spur the population growth. So it goes the other way around as well. Like, people tend to move. Like, how many Sabahans actually in Klang Valley right now are looking for better opportunities, and Sarawakan as well. So I think the real debate is to actually bring some development to Kuching, to Bintulu, Miri, like you said, in Tawau, Sandakan. Kinabalu is huge, with most of them, like I think 90% of them is just forest reserve. So how could actual local can benefit from if 90% of their huge district is just a forest reserve? So yeah, I mean, in empowerment in terms of what we can derive from a Malaysian Agreement towards Kota Kinabalu and Kuching should be just equally dispersed into satellite cities, maybe even like Tuara and Papar as well.
Definitely. And I'm just going off on a tangent here, but still related to MA63. I think over-reliance on MA63 would become, in a way, a pit for us, a sandpit for a lot of Sabahan leaders. Now, I made the argument in the article saying that we need to look beyond MA63 because there are certain things in MA63 aren't even covered, doesn't cover certain industries. So we, like Sabah, we are very proud of our tourism industry. It's a very comprehensive industry, but a lot of the functions still, I mean, we do have a ministry here, but how much of that functions are autonomous in a way? Or let's even look at multimedia and communications infrastructure. We don't have a ministry like that. It's still waiting for ministries in the federal government, such as MCMC, to approve certain projects. And we don't really have any much agency over how we want to improve the communications infrastructure here in Sabah. So this is something that MA63 did not cover. And I don't think they were able to predict that because, who would have thought that tourism or multimedia would become a huge industry that's very vital now to a state's economic growth. So that's why I need to look more beyond MA63. And I think we need to follow Sarawak's approaches, which is we ask for things on an ad hoc basis based on our own needs. And that comes with asking for a new deal and a new arrangement. Because if you want to ask for more than MA63, then the federal government's always going to say, hey, you asked for what's in MA63. This is not in MA63, so why are you even asking for it? So that is the sandpit that we risk falling into.
Right? Yeah, it could be like a whole night if we're going to talk about what's going south with Sabah right now. And definitely Sarawak is in the better state, and Sabah should, through HGG administration and the state election is coming up maybe this year or next year, so it should be another change also for Sabah, because otherwise it's going to be the same thing over and over again. And it's scary to see how electricity also being rationed in the capital of Sabah. It's not just we talk about one particular small city in Sabah, but the main capital where most its GDP contributed from. So, finger crossed for Sabah in the coming future. Anything you wanna close that topic again?
I think when it comes to younger people who are listening, because I know that a lot of young people still aren't sure about what MA63 is, don't be too constrained by it. Just keep having this idea that what do you really want out of Sabah, and how do you want to negotiate that? How do you want to strategize that? MA63 is not a be-all, end-all agreement, but it can be just a guidepost for leaders in moving forward when it comes to asking for more agency and more decentralization from the federal government.
That is sort of calling for a new referendum, Adi.
If we could have a referendum, that would be perfect.
Yeah, so we're going to be like Scotland, asking from the British government for a referendum. But I don't know if federal government of Malaysia would even entertain that idea.
It's within our rights, I think, to still have a referendum, but it's never been done. So whoever wants to jumpstart the idea, be my guest. I'll be the first to sign up.
Yeah, and these challenges thrown to our aduns and Sabahans aduns and MPs to actually bring this to action. All right, with that, that's the end for this topic. We're going to have another topic, which is a little bit out of the ordinary, because normally we're going to talk about politics, news, and whatnot, economy. But next one, it's none of this. So stay tuned. Coming right up next.